Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. It's really a pleasure to have you again. And we are back. We are back to our second webinar for the ASP Summit 2024 Webinar Series 5 with the major topic, the medical device reprocessing, back to the future. So before we get introduced for our host and our two hosts, not one, only one, and the moderator for today, I'd like to give you some key take-home messages in terms of housekeeping for you have a great experience. So first of all, please make sure you switch off any non-essential applications on your device that may take away from you the internet bandwidth. And for sure, please, just for you to know, today webinar will start with a 40 minutes presentation split by the two hosts, followed by a 10 minutes Q&A session. And we will conclude the webinar with your key take-home messages and takeaways. And of course, we will introduce you for the next webinar topic and speaker. And this webinar will be finished in about 1 hour to respect everybody's agenda. If you have any questions for the presenter that you want to answer, to be answered by him, both of them, please make sure you type them on the chat box. Even if we cannot cover them today, we try to cover it following the webinar. In order to make the presentation part of this webinar more interactive, we can also have several live polls like always, and you will have few seconds to reply to answer to our speaker question. So make sure you use that time to do it. And one last point, this webinar will be recorded, so the link will be sent to you, to all the registrants that have registered for the webinar afterwards, even the ones that cannot participate today live. And yeah, it's now my big pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, for the ones that have been in previous series and also on the previous webinar with Dr. Elisabetta Anzanello. I had as moderator Dr. Carlos Paus, that is also the scientific director for our Summit webinar series. And so I'd like to welcome again Dr. Paulus. It's a pleasure, and thanks for joining us today again. I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Jaime. Hello, everyone. So welcome for this new webinar. So today we are going to talk about the new standard for H2O2 sterilization, so with the ISO 22441. And well, today it will be a different webinar, as we will have not only one, but truly two speakers. And before introducing to them, just let's take a look at the attendees that we have today. So as always, we have attendees from all over the world, mainly from the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, but also from some countries in Europe, and also in other continents. So regarding the professions, well, we can see that we have a lot of nurses and infection and prevention and control specialists, as always, also healthcare managers and decontamination leader and managers. And most of you work at the sterile services department. So this is what we are today. So, well, let's move for the presenters. So we have today Mr. Philippe Destrez, which is the scientific director of ASP AMA, and he is at Paris in France. Philippe is also has over 35 years experience in medical device industry, and he has been involved in various ISO and EN committees for developing norms, and in particular those in charge of H2O2 standards. And well, as you can see, he also contributed to the French and the WHFH as sterilization guidelines. And also, after Mr. Philippe, we'll have Mr. Wouter, that you know probably from one of the webinars of the last series. And Wouter is also very experienced in this field. So he works in the operating room and the hospital decontamination in the University Hospital of Louvain, and he is the project manager related to CSSD and OR and instrumental management lead in those areas. He has been also involved in developing some guidelines, namely in Belgium, and well, is also involved in teaching courses, and as you can see, in various schools. So be welcome, and I hand over to our first speaker, which will be talking about the new standard ISO 22441, Mr. Philippe Distress. So welcome, Philippe.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Palos. Can you see me and hear me well? Is it okay?
Yes, we can. Okay. Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so thank you for welcoming me on your screen today. The objective for my presentation is a high-level overview of ISO 22441 that Dr. Palos has already presented as the new H2O2 process standards. We'll start with a reminder of the link between standards, regulation, and guidelines, continue with an update on other H2O2 standards which are currently in preparation, before walking through ISO 22441 paragraph and concluding with a take-home message. Can you go to the next slide, Jim? So before doing so, no, the questions. So before starting the presentation, a few questions to know how much the audience knows about these standards. Is it the first time you hear about it? You heard about it, but know little. You have already decided to implement 22441, but need to know more to be able to do it, or you're already an expert in ISO 22441. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer, and I will allow Jamie to comment your answer. It's Jamie, you tell me when you think that it's enough time was given to the audience to answer, and so I can see that most answers that you know about it, but need to improve your knowledge. So it's it could start useful to start the presentation. So I suggest, Jamie, that we go to the next slide.
Correct.
And the next slide will be to discuss general consideration on how standards are linked to guidelines and regulations. So as you know, guidelines, standards are published by international organizations such as ISO. Are documents which result from a consensus with experts representing different countries. They are generally of voluntary applications, and their basic purpose is to minimize the risk of inadequate or unsafe products or services, and to encourage progress in technologies and progress in best practices. Can you click again? Can you? Yeah, standards come in support of regulation, but they never supersede regulation. We'll have occasions to come back on that later on during the presentations. Guidelines, the kind of combined regulations, guidelines combine regulations and standards. by adding layers, and they add layers of practical recommendations, and guidelines themselves serve as a framework for education. Can you go to the next one? This complex pictures displays all international sterilization standards. I could have made the pictures even more complex by displaying radiation standards, but because they are not used in hospitals, I didn't do that. As you can see on the screen, you have clear blue and dark blue cells. The dark blue one corresponds to the ISO standard, and the clear blue to CN standard. And there is an agreement between ISO and CN to make these two groups of standard complementary. Click, please. ISO 22441 will replaces ISO 14937 as the reference norm for H2O2. Doesn't mean that ISO 14937 will disappear from this picture. It will still continue to be used for all sterilization modalities which do not have a dedicated norm. Click, please. Like for STEAM and EO, ISO 22441 will be later completed by a BI ISO standard, which will be called 11138-6, and by an equipment standard mainly intended for sterilizer manufacturers. So it's the name of that standard is EN 17180. We'll talk more about these standards in the next slides. So click, please. And click again. So as explained above, H2O2 LTS processes were until now covered by ISO 14937, and H2O2 BIs were and still are according to 11138-1. ISO 22441 was published in 2022. Can we please click? And is currently going through national adoptions at a pace which varies according to country to local procedures. Click, please, again. H2O2, so 11138-6, the future BI standard, and EN 17180, the future equipment standard intended for sterilizer manufacturers, will both be published in 25-26. It's always difficult to predict exactly when the publication will occur due to the complexity of normalization process, but it should be around those dates. Can you go to the next slide? The table of content of ISO 22441 show that process standards like 22441 span from the early stage of development, which are under sterilizer manufacturer responsibility, to daily routine operation by the healthcare facility. Like all sterilization process standard, ISO 22441 contains 12 normative paragraphs and annexes, some normative annexes also. So as you can see from the color code, everything which is normative, that is to say, which contains normative requirement, is in orange letter. The other paragraphs are informative paragraph, so with just explanations pertaining to the normative paragraph. During this presentation, we will circulate together through all the normative paragraph from 1 to 12, and I will also say a few words on Annex E, which provide guidance, useful guidance on the normative paragraph. Go to the next slide, please. So the first paragraph of this standard, like all standard, all process standard, is the scope. That is to say what the standard covers. The formulation that you have on the screen well reflects the broad table of content of ISO 22441, and add that H2O2 LTS processes, what they have in common is that they all use vaporized H2O2 as the sterilizing agent. Can you click just before we leave this slide, just to underline a few words? Yeah, so you can see that what those processes have in common is the H2O2, vaporized H2O2 as the sterilizing agent. We will see in the next slide what sterilizing agent means. When reading a process standard such as ISO 22441, it's important to have in mind that they apply to both healthcare facilities and medical device industries. The two domains are, as you know, very different in practice. In medical device industry, typically the load is always the same and the contamination level is under control. In healthcare facility, loads vary according to surgical activities. And even after careful cleaning, contamination status cannot be guaranteed. This is the reason why the overkill margin, safety margin is used. normative requirement, that is to say what is written in the chapter 1. Can you go back shortly to the former slides to finish? Yeah. The normative requirements, that is to say chapter 1 to 12, must however be common to the two domains, I mean industry and healthcare facilities. And this makes them sometimes difficult to write and read. So this is part of the complexity to read international standards. Let's now go to the next slide. And in the next slide, we'll be saying a few things about prion. The scope of all process standards, not only H2O2, but also steam and other standards, exclude prion inactivation. In the case of H2O2, this is not because H2O2 does not work on prion, you know that it's a case, but there is currently no ISO standardized methods for prion inactivation. They are, however, very well recognized scientific protocol and criteria to evaluate prion inactivation, and they showed the superior efficacy of H2O2 compared to other sterilization methods. And some steroid cycles, as you know, are even able to obtain total inactivation of prion, according to a publication dated from 2009. Let's go now to the next slide, and we'll now go into normative reference, which just lists the other published standard to which ISO 22441 refers. ISO 17180 and EN 17180, sorry, and ISO 11138-6 will appear in this table sheet when they are published. Go now to the next slide, which is terms and definition. And so we won't go through the whole list of terms and definition given in 2241. It's pretty long. We'll just focus on a few key terms which are useful to understand the rest of the presentations. So the first word on which I want to insist is the word variables. They are the physical or chemical entities, such as pressure, temperature, and H2O2 concentrations, which are fundamental to control the process. And parameters are the values of the range linked to each variable. Let's click again. The second keyword is sterilant. So the sterilant is the H2O2 H2O solutions, which is contained in the cartridges. So usually it's a 59% H2O2 H2O solution. And when the sterilant is vaporized in the chamber of the sterilizer, it becomes a sterilizing agent. So the sterilizing agent is what is in contact with the surface of the medical device. You may want to keep in mind that the ISO definition of a sterilant differ from the one which is given to that term by FDA. Now click again, please. The process change device, we'll talk a lot about it during in the next slide. It has different meanings according to the sterilization process, but for ISO, it is best explained in paragraph 8.8 of the standard. In essence, 8.8 says that the PCD is a test item that simulates a real medical device. For healthcare facilities, the PCD must be more resistant than the most challenging device. So it's a very important concept. And as I said, we'll come back on that in the rest of the presentation. Can you please click? The next paragraph is on relates to quality management. It is pretty short and just reminds the key principle of ISO 13485, which is the reference management quality standard for medical device industry and sterilization department. It is more interesting to look at the explanation provided in informative Annex E, which gives explanation on quality management system. Can you go to the next slide? So as I said, informative annex give explanation about the normative paragraph. And E4, in fact, contains 3 scenarios that describe typical responsibility assignments in healthcare facility or industry. Scenario 1 that we are going to shortly detail now pertains to healthcare facilities. The reason why responsibilities are not described in normative paragraph is because standards consider that it's a matter of regulation or guideline. And as you probably remember from the first line, international standards are always careful not to interfere with regulation. So again, this is the reason why this is described in informative annex. But this informative annex is fundamental, and I will continue as we circulate through the next slide to remind you who holds the responsibility for each paragraph of the standard. For process standard, responsibilities are shared between the healthcare facility, obviously, the sterilizer manufacturer, and the medical device manufacturers. The first paragraph related to sterilizer and cycle designs it's pretty obvious, I think, in sterilizer manufacturer hands. Process definition, which pertains to the determination, validation, and descriptions for users of reprocessing installation, is by law under medical device manufacturer. Healthcare facilities' responsibility are outlined by the orange marks on the screen and include the definition of the load and all process validation and routine control tasks. We can go now to the next slide. So with this slide, we are in sterilizer manufacturer domain, and it corresponds to the early development stages where the manufacturer evaluates the microbial efficacy. Can you click? It also evaluates the effect of the process of the sterilizing agent on material, including the biological safety aspect, that is to say, the risk of having toxic residues appearing on the surface of the medical device. And the last point, if you want to click again, is related to the safety of the operator. We'll now go to the following slide, number 6. So paragraph 6 is still in the end of the sterilizer manufacturer, but it goes into more details, and you'll still start seeing on these slides concepts which are closer to what you know from sterilizer equipment. One added value of ISO 22441 compared to ISO 14937 is that it lists the variables. You remember the definition that I gave earlier, which might be measured to adequately control an H2O2 sterilization process. So time, temperature, pressure, and H2O2 concentrations are the minimum variables that must be controlled by a sterilization process. So manufacturers can add additional variables, such as control of the plasma, but at a minimum, time, temperature, pressure, and H2O2 concentrations are as the most important. Time is obvious, I think. Temperature and pressure are not as central as they are for other sterilization processes like steam, but H2O2 activity, like all chemical activities, is influenced by temperature, and vacuum is needed to ensure penetration of H2O2 in packages and devices. For H2O2, like for all chemical process, the key determinant of efficacy is the concentration of the sterilizing agent. It can be measured directly by an H2O2 monitor. Can you click, Jamie? Or indirectly via dose and pressure control. Sterile systems do both, that is to say, direct measure of H2O2 monitoring and indirect control via pressure control and many other things. Can you click again? Paragraph 6 also defines requirements for sterilant and equipment characterizations and for control and monitoring function. It reminds in particular that any failure of a control sensor must be detectable and information must be provided to the operator. Next slide. With the product definition, we are for the first time in the domain of responsibility of the healthcare facility. Healthcare facility will follow instructions for reprocessing that must be defined and evaluated by the medical device manufacturer. So instruction for reprocessing describe the cleaning process and specifies the H2O2 cycles to be used. We'll come back on that key point in the next slide. Device must also be packaged in a compatible sterile barrier. Compatible means that it must be permeable to H2O2, that it must keep its sterile barrier properties after exposure to H2O2, and that no toxic residue should be left on the package and medical device. Next slide. Process, or maybe there is, can you go up one slide? I think there is one slide. It doesn't matter. So yeah, go to the next slide. I will comment what is not appearing on the screen. So process definition is by law under the responsibility of the medical device manufacturers. Tests must be performed to check that conditions for sterility are consistently achieved with a cycle specified in the instruction for reprocessing. Sterility testing means placing a 6-log spore inoculum at the most challenging location within the device and checking that full inactivation of the spores is systematically obtained. Tests are performed at half cycle to reach the sterility assurance level of 10 to the minus 6 at the end of a full cycle. We will see that on a future slide. So let's stay there for the moment. Yeah, okay. So the sterilization process are in fact much more complex than people tend to think. You know, steam, for example, is just not saturated steam. What makes steam so efficient is the release of latent heat when saturated steam condensates on device surfaces. Ethylene oxide needs condensation to penetrate spore membrane. Ethylene oxide is a very penetrative gas, but it's not able to cross the membrane of spores. Click again. Formaldehyde must be converted into liquid formaldehyde to become efficient. Gaseous formaldehyde is not efficient on germs. And H2O2 process, can you click again, proceeds by adsorption, absorption, and optimized condensation. Can you click again? For all sterilization modalities, vacuum at various levels is needed to eliminate gases that could prevent condensation, which, as you saw, is fundamental for all sterilization processes, although in a different manner. For all chemical process, ethylene oxide, LTSF, and H2O2, efficacy varies according to temperature and mainly according to the concentration of the sterilizing agent. And to summarize with the, can you go to the next slide now? So the next slides, you know, the top of it illustrate what I said before about the requirement for the sterility test, that is to say, placing germs at the most difficult location in the device and performing tests at half cycle to reach the 10 to the minus 6 sterility assurance level. Can you click? And what needs to be reminded from the former slide is that, again, sterilization processes or mechanisms are extremely complex. And to make a long story short, it's difficult to model them and to avoid tests on real medical device. What also needs to be done by medical device manufacturers is the compatibility testing, that is repeating cycles under the device to make sure that after exposure to a large number of cycles, the medical device remains fully functional and fully safe for the patients. So again, I insist on the importance of medical device validation. I think that Wouter in his presentation will come back on that. With the growing complexity of medical devices, it's very difficult to avoid, to simulate sterilization and functionality, and tests on real device must be performed. Under the responsibility, it's important to have in mind of the medical device manufacturer. Can we go now to the next slide? With process validation, we are now entering the domain of the healthcare facility, and will stay within the domain of the hospital until the end of the presentation. So although installation operation qualification are often, if not always, subcontracted to the sterilizer manufacturer, the sterilization department is responsible for their implementation and review. Can you click again? Performance qualification is commonly subcontracted either to the sterilizer manufacturer or to a third party. It consists in testing that condition to obtain the 10 to the minus 6 SAL will always be achieved in routine. To obtain that guarantee, you need to perform the PQ with the most challenging load and device combination, and this needs to be done for each cycle. Two approaches are possible. One is to for the healthcare facility to select the most challenging load and device combination. But since real devices cannot be contaminated for obvious reasons, the eyes are placed in or around the load. The second option consists in using a challenge test pack, which is validated to represent the most challenging load. And this challenge test pack is used in combination with a BIPCD, a process challenge device, that's as explained by paragraph 8 of 22441, simulates a device with a 6 logs per inoculum at the most difficult location in that medical device. Can you click again before we leave this slide? But all these operations, even if they are not performed by the healthcare facility, they are under its responsibility and they need to be reviewed and approved by the sterilization department. Next slide. So routine control, it includes the verifications to be performed periodically between validation, or operational control that needs to be performed at each cycle. The control and recording of process parameters are systematic. Can you, yeah, okay. The use of BI, can you click again? There should be a pictures to illustrate this slide. Yeah, okay, here it is. The use of BI CIs or BI PCDs are according to healthcare facility and applicable guidance or regulation. It doesn't mean that ISO 2241 has no interest for CI and BI, but again, it's considered by standard as a matter of local guidance or regulation. So as reminded before, standards avoid to overlap with guidance or regulation. ISO 22441 just reminds that CI and BI must comply to the applicable international standards and that PCD should be in accordance with what we developed earlier on paragraph 8.8. And you can see on the picture on the right here, bottom right, that, go up again, sorry, that a BI is always more meaningful than a CI because for obvious reason, it contains germs. So it's always meaningful that a system which try to simulate germs by chemical actions and BI PCDs, that it's, which simulates real devices, are obviously also always more meaningful than a simple BIs with no PCD functions. Next slide is about load release. So as we said before in the routine control, load release is always at least based on process parameter verification. I'm repeating again, but the standard itself does not impose a use of BI, CI/BI or BI PCD, again, because it's considered as a matter of local regulation. But it doesn't ignore these essential accessories, obviously. Regarding the use of BI, and the position is often made between so-called parametric release and BI release. I don't think this opposition is justified. First, because process parameters must always be controlled, and the use of a BI does not allow you to avoid the control of process parameters. Also, with the new generation of fast readout BIs or BI PCD, the difference between electronic sensors that are installed on the sterilizers and biological sensors, that's the way we could call the new generation of BIs, with fast readout times are becoming less and less. And, you know, again, BI PCDs with 15 minutes readout times could be considered as another kind of sensors to be attached to the sterilizer. Next slide. So between validation, obviously maintenance and calibration needs to be organized. And that's again in the hands of the healthcare facility. And the process must be requalified either after major events, after major failure, or when the sterilizer was relocated. The content of requalification is according to needs. For instance, you won't have to redo installation qualification if the sterilizer was not moved. So now we are reaching the end of the presentation, and we can go to the next slide with the few take-home messages. So I hope you understood from this presentation that compliance to an ISO process standards is not only a matter of sterilizer manufacturer, it's a standard which involve, can you click again? Which involves first the sterilizer and consumable and packaging manufacturers who are responsible for making sure that they comply to applicable paragraph of ISO 22441 and other standards which are related to it. But it also concerns the medical device manufacturers, who is, again, it's important to have in mind, by law, obliged to provide and validate accurate instruction for reprocessing. And remember that given the growing complexity of minimally invasive surgical devices. It's pretty difficult to do. You cannot avoid simulation real devices, and this is often done in partnership with experienced sterilizer manufacturers. Click again, and last but not least, compliance to a process standards such as ISO 2241 also involve the healthcare facility for the implementation of the process validations in accordance with MDM instruction for reprocessing and sterilizer manufacturers IFU. All this is obviously done, can you click again, in accordance with applicable guidelines and regulation, for example, for the use of BI, BIPCD, and CIF. With that said, I thank you for your attention, and I will now give the control of the presentation to my friend Wouter.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Philippe. I will start first with ISO 22441 applicability at the CSSD. And next slide, we will start with the question, of course, that's something important. Then the question, yes, a new norm, like we just presented, how do you learn the content of that norm? First, reading it yourself, training or symposium by the professionals organizations of your national in your country, following the trainings offered by manufacturer of the validation institute, or I wait until I really need to use the norm before and learning about it. Okay. I think we can close the poll to see the results. Thank you. It's surprisingly that a lot of you also are pretending to reading, start trying to reading the norm yourself. So that's really, and of course, I think indeed our professional organizations play a very important role in the teaching about new norms and the content of it. So next slide, please. Yes. So first of all, a new norm. It's important that if you use a quality system, that one way or the other, at a certain norm, at some certain moment, new norms are coming on to the market, and at that moment, one way or the other, you need to know how this norm conspects and how it has an influence on your daily procedures. So that means that in your quality system, you have a structure that makes sure that, okay, I have a new norm, in this case, the ISO 22441, and what does it mean for my hydrogen peroxide process? Next slide, please. It's important that within your quality system, you have chapters that are really talking about compliance with standards or compliance with medical device regulations, because in this case, the norm applies to both. That means that you need to look at what norm are there available and how does this have an influence on my medical devices who I'm reprocessing. So that means that you're going to look out what's the content of the new norm, and of course, which impact does it has on my CSSD, and how do I get the necessary information? Next slide, please. And of course, what was surprisingly in the poll that was that a lot of you are really doing an effort to reading it yourself, and I suppose then it's at that moment important that when you're reading the norm, that at that moment you understand what's in there and what would be the impact on the norm. And I don't think that's really as easy as it sounds. We had now the reading of Philippe, and Philippe knows the norm because he was one of the people who was on the birth of the norm. So that's important. And of course, the second thing is training or symposia by professional organization. I think that's the most important one, because at that moment, people who know the norm and maybe can make the translation to your daily operations for you, so you even know within the norm what you need to what you need to do. And if possible, of course, training offered by the manufacturers of the validation institute, because they are using the norms at the end to validate your processes. So you make sure that when you talk with those validation institutes, that they know about the norm and they use the new norm to validate what's possible. And of course, analyzing and implementing those changes within your CSSD according to the new norm is, it's a lot of work. So that means that you need to look at the norm, and you need to find someone who has time and he gives the effort to look at the norm and say, okay, these processes are changing or are not changing in the best case, and how they are impacting your daily CSD process, and making sure that changes are made if necessary in your daily thing. Yeah, next slide. If we then look at process validation, load release, two items that Philippe already mentioned in daily practice, we have the next question. How to validate your process and release the loads? We do it the same as until now, so new norm, but we don't change anything. Follow training by the professional organization again, or follow trainings offered by the sterilizer manufacturer, of following trainings offered by the validation institutes. Where do you find the information that in your case is the most important, or in which one you trust the most that they know about what they are talking? Okay. Votes are still coming in. And if we look, we will stop the poll now. We have a good idea, because we see that indeed, again, trainings who are followed and organized by the professional organizations or by the sterilizer manufacturers are indeed the most important, I think, to know about the impact of the new norm on your validation process and the loads. Next slide, please. Good. If you look in daily practice at the process validation, first thing you need to ask, was there a difference with the ISO 13937 without the ISO 22441? That's the first thing you need to look at. The second thing, okay, IQ, OQ, PQ. What's the impact on my daily practice in this case? And of course, what's really important, what's changed, is that the PQ is for every operating cycle. So if you have a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer with more than one program, you need to make sure that for every program, you will perform that performance qualification. And using a PCD or defining worst case load, I think that's the most difficult one. That was already a challenge in making sure that you have the worst case load in steam sterilization processes. But in this case, you also need to go and look at every device you are reprocessing into the hydrogen peroxide, vaporized hydrogen peroxide process. And how do I, as an end user, know which would be the most challenging load for my sterilizing, for my hydrogen peroxide process? I don't think that's not easy, but it's something you need to talk about again with your sterilizer manufacturer, but also looking at your medical devices where you are reprocessing. So again, someone will need to take some time to look at those items. And of course, yeah, like Philippe already said, what's a PCD? That's a device that would challenge your load the most to make sure that your validation is correct. Next slide, please. And if you look more closely, then you see indeed how does a validation run? Yeah, and you need to have a microbiology performance qualification, and you see it's all the 6 points need to be there for the end of the validation. That means you need to do it for every cycle. You need to find the most challenging device with an inoculum or a BI that's in the most challenging position of your sterilizer. You make sure that it is in packaging, and that's something important to taking in account, because it depends if you're using more than one type of packaging. It's packaging, it needs to be compatible, of course, with hydrogen peroxide. By example, do you use sterilization wraps, or do you use, by example, Tyvek? Do you maybe do double packaging of Tyvek? So that means that you need to declare yourself in which type of packaging you say, this is how I want to validate my devices. And of course, if you look at the cycle parameters, then you have now the variables you need to look at with a specified tolerance. And like Philippe told, it's of course the half cycle with the no positive BIs who will at the end declare that your validation is in order. Next slide. Then looking at releasing loads, is something changing in my releasing loads? I am already using hydrogen peroxide for such a long time, and yeah, I released my loads. The machine said my process was fine, and I look at some parameters, but which parameters I'm going to look at? And in this case, sometimes it's critical versus variable, and that was a difficult thing to do. Because critical means that if that parameter is not within the right set points, then it means the cycle is not okay. And variable parameters, that means you have different parameters who can variable depending on your load. But if they are standing within those within the set points, your load will be fine. And like Philippe told, it's pressure, it's temperature, it's time, and of course the hydrogen peroxide concentration. Does this mean that in every release of load, you need to check all those parameters? Or is some of them okay? And do you need to check all the parameters of all the process steps in this case? Of course, it is not the case. So that means, and within, am I going to do a parametric release, or am I really using BIs or CIs? And that's indeed that it's something that's suggested in mostly kind, and maybe in some countries regulations are obligated to do some BI or CI. But I think it's really important that within your quality system and with your quality team and on daily practice, you need to find the best way to releasing. And for example, next slide, please. This is how we releasing loads in our CSSD. This is a param print, and you see we have together with the manufacturer of the sterilizer, we looked at all the parameters and we looked at, okay, which parameters are important for us, which parameters have a significant influence on the end result of your sterilization process. And these are the ones we have chosen that are mostly pressurized, pressure, and the hydrogen peroxide concentration within the process. In this case, this is manually released, and now for the moment, this is already done electronically within our traceability system. So, but this is something that's different for all the different kind of hydrogen peroxide sterilizers. So it's important that you look at it yourself and together with the manufacturer, look at, okay, which parameters are now the variables who are the most important to make sure I can do some parametric release. Next slide, please. So how do you check the compatibility of your instrument with your sterilization? It's only if it is in the IFU, it's okay. Otherwise, it's not compatible with my process. If the representative of the medical device manufacturer says it's compatible, it's okay for me. Is the sterilizer manufacturer says it's compatible, it's okay for me. And I decide if the medical device is compatible. It's based on my experience. Okay, we can stop the poll. It's really clear. I think that everybody is indeed following the correct thing. I think the IFU is indeed the most important part of this thing. Next slide, please. It's certainly the IFU, because certainly if we look at the European guidelines now with the new medical device regulation, it's really strict that medical device manufacturers need to make sure that in their validation of their reprocessing cycles, they look at which sterilization principle can be used to safely reprocess their instruments and to make sure their life cycle is as normal as generally possible. That means you look at instructions for use, and hopefully there is a general idea about which process can be used. And I hope with the new norm that instead of really every manufacturer is validating every type of hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, it will be a more general thing that's tested. Yeah, you can sterilize my medical device according to ISO 22441, like it is in sterilization, in steam sterilization, and maybe later, and it's validated if your machine is built according to the new building norm, the 17180, I think, if I'm correct. That means that general process validation is present. Instead of that, there is a specific sterilizer mentioned in the IFU, and maybe you just have another brand of hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, and you think, oh, can I now sterilize this device in my process? That will be, I think, more fine in the future. Okay, next slide. Now the next thing is now I'm going to buy a new one. So there's a new norm. So how do I look at tenders? That means I'm tendering for a new hydrogen peroxide sterilizer. That means in this case, you can at the moment still use both ISO norms, the ISO 22441 and the ISO 14937. And of course, at a certain moment in Belgium already, the new norm is already accepted. But on the EN side, it still needs to be generalized in the near future. And of course, if the 17180 is also approved and published, then again, you have some clear norms that you can put in your tender to make sure that if a manufacturer offers you a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, it will be confirming and consistent with the new norms available for hydrogen peroxide sterilizers. Next slide. So if we look at the take-home messages, first of all, find for yourself the way to understand the content and the impact of the norm. Take your time for it. Search for the people who can help you manufacture sterilizers, your professional organizations who will know how to reach. Use the new variables, pressure, time, temperature, and hydrogen peroxide concentration together, if necessary, with BICI to look at the load release and which way you can conduct it on your daily process. Defining a well thought out worst case for your hydrogen peroxide cycle validation, and that's something you need to make sure to build in the most safety in your process. If the worst case is okay, that means that everything what's less a challenge will certainly be okay after your hydrogen peroxide sterilization process. And of course, ISO 22441 will help you to safely connect medical devices with your hydrogen peroxide sterilization process. So we have a base to look at and to make sure that your medical device can be sterilized in a hydrogen peroxide process in case of always looking at, oh, it's approved for device 1, but not for my device. I'm going to make sure that's compatible. So this will also be covered by the ISO 22441. So thank you very much. I give the word back to Dr. Carlos.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for your excellent talk, and also to Philip. So we have here 2 questions on the chat, and I ask you to be brief because we are somehow on the timeline. So for Philip, why do you think the process of validation is important in this area?
So again, short answer, but validation, as you understood, the process standard like 22441 reminds that every stakeholders is important, as a role to play, the medical device manufacturers, the sterilizer manufacturers, and validation by the end users is the only occasion that you have to make sure that everything works, that everything connects, and that your process works with your own device, with your own installations, according to your own surgical programs and with obviously your own team.
And Wouter, well, how do we make sure that MD is compatible with the sterilizer that you use?
For medical devices, it's really important that if it's in the IFU, literally, it's the most easy way. But I think for a lot of devices that are not validated by the manufacturers already for hydrogen peroxide sterilization processes, I think you have to have a really close connection with your medical device, your sterilizer manufacturer, and have periodically, if you have lists, check them with them, and they will help you to make the connection between the medical device manufacturer and the sterilizer manufacturer to make sure that your device is compatible, and there will not, you assure sterility and you assure that your device will keep working on a correct way.
Yeah, that is challenging because many times we don't have the tested the devices tested for
No.
this low sterilization temperature.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and another question, and the last one also to you, Wouter. How do you make sure that you can integrate the ISO, this new ISO on your central sterilization department?
Oh, I must honestly say it's always a question of time. Sometimes you can just let it come and just do what you're doing, and if you're certain that your process is fine, the impact will be minimal. But on the other side, quality is something that needs to be applicable and available in every CSSD, and someone needs to occupy with quality and make sure that if things are coming from new norms are implemented. And one important tip is that make sure that you have a subscription of your normative committee of your country, where you automatically will receive notes that new norms are coming, or new norms are in development, or new norms are now applicable for your country. So I think that's an important tip.
Yeah, and we have a last question. It's a last-minute question for Philip. Philip, how often should the sterilizer be revalidated?
So there is no indication in the standards. Standard says that it must be requalified. That's the exact terminology. But the periodicity is according to practice. But a general practice in all countries all around the world is to do yearly requalification, that is to say every year.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this answer. So it's important to know that there is no unique information or guideline for this. So thank you all. I am going to also to say goodbye. So thank you very much for being with us. And I will hand over to Jaime. I wish you a good summer holidays for those ones that have holidays on the next few months. And so see you in September.
Before we say goodbye to everyone and I'd like to thank first to our participants, starting with our presenters, Philippe Distré and Wouter Miert. Really appreciate your insightful presentations today. Also, Dr. Paulus for his moderation. And with this, I want to tell you that our next webinar, it will be in September 26, about innovations on the RA devices reprocessing. And we will count with Mr. Oleg Tux, that is Associate Science Lecturer from the Technology University of Dublin on Ireland, to drive that talk to us. Before we leave, don't forget that we will have a short survey. You will receive an email with a link for the survey, because we always can do better and we want to learn from you. And also on the same email, you will receive a fact sheet with the resume of this presentation, as well the certificate that you can customize with your name for today's webinar. Finally, I want to thank you all that have participated on this webinar. I believe it was really useful. I hope that was also really helpful and useful for our audience. And before we leave, I just want to thanks for your attendance today, and wish you all a lovely vacation period. And I hope to see you all on next webinar on September 6th, 26th. So with this, we close for today and wish you lovely holidays.